The year 1721. A young woman named Peter Blagojevic dies in the small Serbian village of Kiceljevo. 48 days later, 9 villagers are dead, and every single one of them, on their deathbeds, whispered the same thing. Peter had visited them in the night. He had sat on their chests, pressed his lips to their throats, and drunk something vital from them. The village elders did what any rational person would do. They dug up the body. The corpse had fresh blood at the mouth, new skin growing over old wounds, and the hair and nails had lengthened. They drove a stake through his heart. He screamed. That is the moment the word vampire entered the Austrian imperial records for the first time, carried by an official named Frombald, who had been sent to investigate and who wrote back to Vienna in a panic, saying he had seen things he could not explain. But before we dismiss this as peasant ignorance, consider the numbers. Between 1721 and 1759, dozens of similar cases were formally documented across the Habsburg Empire. In Medveda, in 1732, a former soldier named Arnold Paul had died after a fall from a hay wagon. He returned. Within 8 days, 17 people were dead or dying, all of them claiming Paul had attacked them at night. The Austrian authorities sent a military commission of surgeons and officers. They exhumed Paul. They found him entirely without decomposition. They cut out his heart, burned it, and scattered the ashes. The deaths stopped immediately. The official report, the Visum et Repertum, signed by 5 military doctors, became a bestseller across Europe. It was translated into German, French, and Italian. Voltaire discussed it. The Enlightenment had to stop and take vampires seriously. Think about that for a moment. The sharpest minds of the 18th century could not dismiss what those villagers saw. They had to wrestle with it, document it, and find a way to explain it within their own frameworks. If you want to keep uncovering these hidden layers where history, psychology, and the uncanny converge, subscribe to this channel. And in the comments, tell me, what first comes to mind when you realize that Voltaire himself had to take vampires seriously? Here is what the evidence actually shows. These were not supernatural events. They were a chain of medical, psychological, and social breakdowns that the 18th century mind had no vocabulary to describe. The first link is the most obvious in hindsight: tuberculosis. The classic vampire symptoms in the historical records: pale skin, coughing blood, weight loss, night sweats, a sense of suffocation, death within weeks, are a near-perfect match for pulmonary consumption. In a tightly knit village, one person develops active tuberculosis. They cough blood onto the earthen floor. They die. Weeks later, another person in the same household begins showing the same symptoms, and another, and another. To the villager watching their family collapse one by one, the pattern looked like predation. It looked like someone coming back to finish the job. But the second link is where it gets specific: the preserved bodies. When Eastern European villagers exhumed corpses months after burial, they sometimes found them in a state that looked nothing like death. The medical term is saponification. When a body is buried in cold, wet, clay-rich soil with low oxygen, the fatty tissue converts to a waxy substance called adiposuret. The skin shrinks, pulling tight over the bones, which makes the hair and nails appear to have grown. Internal organs collapse. A dark fluid from the decomposing lungs can seep through the trachea and out of the mouth. To the exhumers who had no germ theory, no forensic pathology, no understanding of anaerobic chemical reactions, what they saw looked exactly like a corpse that had been feeding. You have probably heard this explanation before. You have heard that vampires were just misunderstood disease outbreaks, or that panics happen when isolated people see dead bodies doing normal dead body things. That answer is too clean. It explains the symptoms, but not the panic, because tuberculosis was everywhere. Adiposuret happens in every cold climate cemetery, but vampire panics did not happen everywhere. They happened in very specific times and places, and the pattern is not medical. It is political. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Habsburg monarchy was pushing its border eastward into the Balkans, displacing Orthodox communities, redrawing parish boundaries, and imposing Catholic bureaucracy on villages that had never had a written land deed. A man named Petar Blagojevic did not just die. He died as a Kmecki stareshina, a village headman who had held authority over the distribution of common land and the resolution of feuds. When he died, the power vacuum did not just break village politics. It broke the unspoken contract between the living and the dead. The dead were supposed to stay dead. They were supposed to let the debts and disputes die with them. When a headman died, he was supposed to take his authority to the grave. But if his body was found with fresh blood at the mouth, it meant he refused to go. It meant the contract was broken. And here is the unsettled part. The vampire was not a monster that attacked randomly. The vampire attacked family first. In every documented case from the 1720s, the first victims were the closest kin, then the neighbors, then the rivals who had disputed the dead person's property. The vampire was a machine of unprocessed grievance. If you had owed a debt to the deceased and not paid, you were the next to die. If you had insulted them at a wedding, you were the next. The body did not care about innocence. It cared about the map of social frictions the dead person had left behind. The Austrian officials who investigated these cases were trained in rationalist medicine. They measured decomposition rates. They interviewed witnesses. They autopsied bodies with surgical precision. And yet in case after case, they signed off on staking and burning. Not because they believed in the supernatural, because the alternative was worse. If they declared the deaths a natural epidemic, they would have to impose quarantine, confiscate property, lock down villages, and explain to Vienna why imperial resources were being used for a localized health crisis. If they declared it a vampire, they could burn one body, let the village believe the threat was over, and pack their bags. The vampire was not a belief that defeated reason. The vampire was a tool that reason used to avoid the harder truth. If this idea unsettles you,
the
you are
stories
in the right
we
place.
tell ourselves
The
are
stories
not
we
always
tell
the
ourselves
truth.
are not always the truth.
They are sometimes
They are
the
sometimes
tools
the very
that allow us
tools
to
that
function.
allow us to function. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring the shadow side of rationalism with us, and drop a comment. What is one belief you hold that might actually be a tool to avoid a harder truth? This brings us to the larger pattern that nobody wants to admit. The vampire panic of the 1720s was not the last. It was actually the template. Between 1845 and 1855, a wave of vampire exhumations swept through rural New England, centered on a town called Jewett City in Connecticut. Families dug up their own relatives and burned their hearts because consumption was killing entire households. In 1903, the village of Mamări in Romania exhumed a suspected vampire named Gheorghe, despite the Romanian Orthodox Church condemning the practice. In 2004, in the village of Valeani in western Romania, relatives of a recently deceased man named Todor Balan dug up his body, cut out his heart, burned it, mixed the ashes with water, and made his surviving daughter drink it. She was described as terrified, but willing. She believed it was the only way to stop the nightmares that had plagued her since her father's death. Every explanation we have for these events feels incomplete. The medical explanation cannot account for the social targeting. The social explanation cannot account for the geographic specificity. The political explanation cannot account for the persistence across centuries and continents. The truth is that the vampire is not a diagnosis. It is not a superstition. It is a backup cognitive system that the human brain activates when the normal frameworks for processing death, disease, and justice collapse. When you cannot see the germ, when the priest cannot help, when the doctor cannot explain why one family loses 6 members in 8 weeks, your brain reaches for a story that has all the pieces, a specific origin, a visible mechanism, a curable solution. Stake the heart, burn the body. The nightmare ends. And that is what makes the vampire so unsettling to any rational mind, because it is not wrong to do what those villagers did. They were using their intelligence to solve a problem with the tools they had. The problem was real. The sequence of death was real. The blood was real. They built a model of causality that fit the evidence perfectly. It was correct in its structure. It was only wrong in its ontology. They identified a vector for the disease, and they were right. They just misidentified the nature of the vector. They called it a revenant. We call it a bacterium. The difference is a microscope, not intelligence. Here's the question that our rationalist cannot answer. If we were transported back to Kisiljevo in 1721, and we showed the villagers a microscope, and we explained that Peter Blagojevich died of a bacterial infection that had spread to his family before he showed symptoms, and that the post-mortem growth of hair and nails and the fresh blood at the mouth were natural chemical processes, would the panic have stopped? Probably not, because the villagers did not only need an explanation for the death, they needed an explanation for the betrayal. Peter had been their headman, he had been trusted, he had been loved, and he had killed them anyway, not out of malice, but out of something far worse. He had killed them without meaning to, without knowing, without having any control over the bodies he left behind. The vampire is not what we fear. The vampire is what we cannot forgive. We cannot forgive the dead for leaving us with their unfinished business. We cannot forgive the people we love for making us responsible for the mess they did not clean up. And we cannot forgive ourselves for the rage we feel at them for dying before we were ready. The vampire panic is the shadow of grief that refuses to turn into acceptance. It is the unresolved argument you never got to finish, the apology you never received, the debt that remains unpaid, and your brain would rather believe that the corpse is crawling out of the grave to collect than face the truth that the debt will never be settled because the person who owes it is gone. This is the deepest insight the vampire gives us. that the dead are not the ones haunting us, we are haunting ourselves. If you want to see more of these mythic, psychological excavations, subscribe before the silence settles. And in the comments, share a moment when you felt the need to stake a conversation you could not survive continuing. Every vampire story ever told, every novel, every film, every folklore transcript is a version of one sentence. You cannot leave. You are not allowed to abandon me. The vampire does not drink blood. The vampire drinks attention. It drinks memory. It drinks the energy of the living who refuse to let the dead rest, because letting them rest means admitting that the conversation is over. Look at the vampire narratives we are still producing today. They are never about the disease. They are never about the decomposition. They are about obsession, about refusal to let go, about a love so possessive it survives the death of the body. Twilight is a vampire story about a man who cannot stop watching a sleeping girl. Interview with the Vampire is about two immortal beings who cannot stop hurting each other because they cannot walk away. Let the Right One In is about a lonely boy who discovers that the only person who accepts him is a vampire who needs him to kill for her. These are not horror stories. They are love stories that refuse to end, and that is the real reason the vampire panics spread across Europe for nearly a century. Not because people were stupid, not because they lacked science, because the vampire gave them a language for a grief so overwhelming that it needed a monster to carry its weight. The tuberculosis killed the body. The vampire killed the guilt. The villagers did not dig up the graves because they were afraid of the dead. They dug up the graves because they were afraid of the silence. If you have ever found yourself unable to let go of someone who hurt you or someone you failed to protect, you understand exactly what the people of Kiselyevo were doing when they drove a stake through Peter Blagojevich's heart. They were not destroying a monster. They were ending a conversation they could not survive continuing. The body screamed, and then the silence was finally complete.